Hey everyone, Mr. Smith here. In this video, we're going to talk about something called the zero product property. We're actually going to use that to build up to solving a quadratic equation. So let's talk about the zero product property first. In order for me to explain what this is, I thought it would be helpful just to look at a couple of basic logical statements that kind of illustrate what this thing means. So um, if I show you this statement, 2 times 2 equals 0. Well, we know that that's true. 2 times 2 obviously equals 0. That's not very hard for us to think about. We know that that's true. Okay, what if we make it a little bit more general? A times 0 equals 0. Um, this is still true, and notice that it doesn't matter what A is. This is true because it's A something times 0. So anything times 0 still equals 0. Doesn't matter what A is, we know that this is true because it's being multiplied by 0. Okay, so now let me show you another statement. A times B equals 0. Let's just think about that for a second. We don't know what A and B are. We have no idea what they are. All we know is that when I multiply them together, they equal 0. So the question that I want to ask you to chew on is, what does this mean about A and B? If 2 times 0 equals 0, A times 0 equals 0, A times B equals 0, well, what does that have to mean about A and B? Well, if you just think about it for a second, since these two things being multiplied together equals 0, um, one of them, or both of them, one of them or both of them must equal 0. In order for this statement to be true, for A times B equals 0 to be true, either A or B must be 0. That just has to be true. Both of them could be, one of them could be. This must be true. A equals 0 or B equals 0. This is the whole premise of the zero product property. Anytime you have two things multiplied together that equals 0, one or both of them it's necessary that one of them equals 0 in order for that statement to be true. Okay, so that's the gist of the zero product property. Let me show you an example of when we actually use this thing to help us solve a quadratic equation. So let's say you're given a problem that looks like this. X minus 4 times x plus 5 equals 0. And I ask you to solve using the zero product property. Well, what we just talked about is that since these two things multiplied together equals 0, remember that means that one or both of them must be 0. That has to be true. One of these things or both of these things must equal 0. So when I'm solving a quadratic equation, I'm trying to solve for x. That means I'm trying to get x alone. Just like when we normally solve just a basic linear equation, I'm still just trying to get x by itself. I can use the zero product property to help me do that in this case. Since I know that one of these things equals 0, or both of them need to equal 0, I can just do a little trick here, and I can actually break this thing up into two pieces and set both of these equal to 0. So I have x minus 4. That might be 0. X plus 5, that also could be 0, because I know that when they multiply together, they equal 0. That's the whole application of the zero product property. And now these are two equations that are really, really, really easy for me to solve. So in this first one, I'm just going to solve both of them. To get x alone here, I'm just going to add 4 to both sides. And I get x equals 4. In the second one, since this is plus 5, I need to subtract 5. And I get x equals negative 5. Okay, so it turns out these are the two solutions to my equation, x equals 4 and x equals negative 5. When you solve a quadratic equation, you do in fact end up with two solutions. Okay, x can be 4 or x can be negative 5. All right, but the whole basis of this trick that I pulled is the zero product property, because I know that these things could equal 0, and that allows me to solve them for x. All right, so that's a pretty basic example. Let's look at one that might be a little more complicated. Again, we're solving using the zero product property. 2x plus 1 times 3x minus 2 equals 0. Anytime I see two things multiplied together that equals 0, I'm automatically going to think I'm going to use the zero product property every single time. If I ever have two things multiplied together that equals 0, I just know that this is the method that I'm going to use to solve. I'm going to take both of these things, I'm going to split them up into two pieces, and I'm going to set both of them equal to 0. So I get 2x plus 1 equals 0, and I get 3x minus 2 equals 0. Now I have two equations that are pretty easy to solve, and I'm just going to solve them both for x. Okay. This one is, these are both going to be a little bit more complicated because I'll end up with fractions. You'll see what happens. I'm trying to solve for x. I need to ask myself, what's happening to x? How do I get it alone? Well, I've got this plus 1 here, so I need to undo that by subtracting 1. I'll have 2x equals negative 1. And now again, what's happening to x? It's being multiplied by 2. So if I divide both sides by 2 to undo that, I get x equals negative 1/2. So weird looking 1/2, negative 1/2. Okay, so there's one of my solutions. I get x equals negative 1/2. Remember, you can just leave this as a fraction. You don't need to write it as 0.5 or anything like that. So there's one of my solutions. Let's solve this one to get my second solution. Again, I have this minus 2. I always do addition and subtraction first. So since this is subtracting, I'm going to undo that by adding. I get 3x equals 2. Now to undo this multiplication by 3, I have to divide by 3. And I get x equals 2/3. And that is my second solution. Okay, so this is maybe a little more complicated example of the zero product property because we end up with a fraction, but the process is still the same. I saw that these two things are being multiplied together and they equal 0, so I split them both apart, set them both equal to 0, and solve them both for x, and that's the process I'm going to use on this type of problem every single time. Okay, let's look at another quick application of the zero product property. We have to use this when we solve a quadratic by factoring. So you're going to see problems like this plenty as you move forward in your math career, or once you get into some science classes. You're going to have to know how to solve things by factoring. Okay. So in order to do this, we know how to factor. We've practiced this a bunch. In order to do this, we have to factor this thing first. Okay. So there's kind of two steps to it. First, you factor, and then you solve using the zero product property, just like we practiced in the last two examples. So let me show you what I mean. First, I'm going to factor this thing. So I'm kind of going to ignore the equals 0, and I'm just going to look at what's over here, x squared plus 3x minus 10. And I'm going to factor that. So remember, I do a times c add to b, so I have to multiply the first and the last numbers. There's this understood 1 right there. So it's 1 times negative 10 gets me negative 10. And now I need two numbers that multiply to negative 10 and add to 3. Hopefully you remember the factoring process from last week. I need two numbers that multiply to negative 10 and add to 3. Well, let's just think about numbers that multiply to negative 10. We could have negative 10 and 1. We could have negative 5 and 2. 5 and 2 could combine to make 3 somehow, but I need to make sure that I get my negatives right. Negative 5 plus 2 would get negative 3, so that's not going to work. But if I switch them to be 5 and negative 2, well, 5 times negative 2 gets me negative 10. 5 plus negative 2 gets me positive 3. So that's the pair that I want to go with. Okay, so now I'm going to rewrite this polynomial, and I'm going to break up the middle term into these two numbers. So it's going to look like this. X squared plus 5x, remember I get the 5 from right here, minus 2x minus 10. And I still have that equals 0 part. I'm not really doing anything with it. I'm just carrying it along with me. All right, so now next in the process, we're going to do factoring by grouping. So I'm going to split this polynomial into two halves. I'm going to look at the first half and say, is there a GCF I can take out of that? Well, there's no number I could pull out, but they both have an x. So I know I could factor an x out of this. X squared divided by x is x. 5x divided by x is plus 5. So there's that one. And now I'm going to do the same thing over here. I'm going to look at this second half and ask, is there a GCF I can take out of that? And remember, whatever I factor out of it, I want it to match this new x plus 5 factor. I see that there's a negative sign here, so I know automatically I want to factor out a negative number. It looks like I could take a 2 out of both of these numbers. This doesn't have an x, so I'm not able to take out a variable. So let's factor out a negative 2. Again, I know I'm going to take out a negative because it has a negative in front. Negative 2, and if I divide negative 2x by negative 2, I get x. Negative 10 divided by negative 2 is positive 5, and look at that. They match. That's exactly what I want. Okay. So now my final answer here is the repeated factor x plus 5 times the two GCFs that I pulled out put together, x minus 2. And that all equals 0. Remember, I just carried that down the whole time. All right, so now let's just write this over here. I have, it's a weird looking arrow. I have x plus 5 times x minus 2 equals 0. Okay. I can solve this now using the zero product property. This looks a lot like the problems that we just did, right? Two things multiplied together that equals 0. I've got two things multiplied together that equals 0. I can solve this thing now to figure out what x needs to be in order to solve my original equation. Okay, so I'm just going to break these two things up, set them both equal to 0. X plus 5 equals 0. X minus 2 equals 0. And now these are really easy equations for me to solve. I have to subtract 5 here. I get x equals negative 5. I have to add 2 here. And I get x equals 2. And now these are my two solutions. X equals negative 5 and x equals positive 2. Okay? So let's just recap what we did briefly. We talked about this thing called the zero product property, where if you have two things being multiplied together that equals 0, in order to solve what these things are, determine what they are, all you have to do is set both of them equal to 0 and solve them. It's a pretty simple process. We can use the zero product property to help us solve an equation by factoring. First, we have to factor the polynomial, and then once we get it factored, we solve the equation by using the zero product property, taking both factors, setting them equal to 0, and solving them for x. Okay, so if you guys have any extra questions, feel free to reach out to me. Hope this video was helpful. We'll see you soon.